March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea. Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara gripped the rail of his destroyer as American aircraft appeared on the horizon. His ship, one of 8 destroyers escorting a vital convoy to reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea, had weathered countless battles. But what happened in the next 15 minutes would shatter everything Japanese naval officers believed about air-to-sea combat. The American B-25s came in low, impossibly low, their noses bristling with machine guns. Then they opened fire, not with cannons, not with bombs, with machine guns that seemed to never stop firing. The sound was distinctive, different from anything Hara's crews had experienced. A deep, rhythmic thunder that grew louder as the aircraft closed. Each burst sent massive projectiles tearing through steel plating, ripping through gun housings, penetrating into the destroyer's vitals. Within moments, Hara watched his deck crew simply disappear under the hail of 50-caliber fire. The forward gun positions fell silent. Men who should have been protected by steel armor lay dead or dying. The ship's superstructure, designed to withstand naval gunfire, proved worthless against this onslaught. Before the skip bombs even arrived to finish the job, Hara's destroyer was already crippled, her crew decimated, her defensive weapons silenced. 7 transports and 4 destroyers would sink in the Bismarck Sea that day. Japanese plans to reinforce New Guinea died with them, but for the survivors pulled from the oil-slicked water, a more profound trauma lingered. They had just encountered the Browning M2 50-caliber heavy machine gun, and nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for its devastating effectiveness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The hatred began not with a single battle, but with a slow, grinding realization that spread through the Imperial Japanese forces like a dark tide. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the open waters of the Pacific, from the caves of Iwo Jima to the skies above the home islands, Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen learned to recognize and fear a weapon that seemed to be everywhere, that never stopped working, and that killed with a brutal efficiency that defied their understanding of modern warfare. This is the story of how the Japanese military, confident in their equipment and training at the war's beginning, came to view one American weapon as the embodiment of their enemy's industrial might and tactical philosophy. The Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun was not the most sophisticated weapon in the American arsenal. It was not the newest design, not the most technologically advanced, not the weapon that received the most attention in propaganda or press accounts. But it became the weapon Japanese forces feared above almost all. Others, not because of any single quality, but because it represented something fundamentally different about American warfare. It was reliable when Japanese weapons failed. It was abundant when Japanese forces struggled with shortages. It was supplied with seemingly unlimited ammunition when Japanese gunners counted every round. And it killed with a cold, mechanical efficiency that overwhelmed Japanese tactical responses developed against conventional weapons. The story begins in 1933, when the M2 entered service with the United States military. John Moses Browning had died 7 years earlier, in 1926, but his final design would outlive him by generations. The weapon was deceptively simple, a short recoil-operated, belt-fed, air-cooled machine gun firing the 50-caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, designated 12.7 by 99 mm. The cartridge itself was formidable, a massive projectile weighing between 647 and 707 grains, depending on the variant, travelling at 2,900 feet per second, carrying over 13,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. To put this in perspective, the Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, their standard crew-served weapon, fired a 7.7 mm round, weighing approximately 204 grains with roughly half the muzzle energy of the American 50 caliber. The difference in destructive power was not incremental, it was categorical, but raw power alone does not explain the weapon's impact. Many nations fielded large-caliber machine guns. The Germans had their 13mm MG-131. The British used the 15mm Baser in armoured vehicles. The Soviets deployed their 12.7mm DSK. What made the American .50 caliber unique was not just its power, but the combination of reliability, production volume, and tactical employment that would define American military operations throughout the Pacific War. Japanese military planners in the late 1930s understood that war with the United States would be a conflict of industrial capacity. They calculated, correctly, that American factories could outproduce Japanese industry by significant margins. What they failed to anticipate was how this industrial advantage would manifest on the battlefield. The assumption, widely held in Japanese military circles, was that quantity could be overcome by quality. Superior training, superior tactics, superior fighting spirit. These would offset American material advantages. The .50 caliber machine gun would prove this assumption catastrophically wrong. The weapon appeared on virtually every American platform. Fighter aircraft, like the P-40 Tomahawk, carried 6 M2 machine guns in their wings. The 4F Wildcat that Marine pilots flew over Guadalcanal mounted 6 .50 calibers. The P-38 Lightning carried 1 20mm cannon and 4 .50 caliber machine guns. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which American pilots called the Jug, bristled with 8 M2 machine guns, delivering 4,400 rounds per minute of combined firepower. American bombers integrated the weapon into every defensive position. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns distributed across nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions. A formation of 36 B-17s meant 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the same devastating cartridge. Even B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, after Major Paul Pappy Gunn's modifications in 1942, carried 8 forward-firing .50 calibers for strafing attacks. On the ground, the M2 appeared on every American combat vehicle. Jeeps mounted them for convoy protection. Half-tracks carried them. Tanks mounted them on turret roofs for anti-aircraft defense and suppressing infantry. Tank destroyers carried them. Even supply vehicles in rear areas mounted .50 calibers against the possibility of Japanese infiltration attacks. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, a half-track mounting 4 M2 machine guns in a powered turret, achieved a combined rate of fire approaching 2,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers called it the meat chopper. Japanese infantry who survived encounters with the M16 called it something else. The demon weapon that fell from the sky, because its most common employment in the Pacific became ground support rather than anti-aircraft work once American air superiority was established. For the Japanese forces who first encountered this weapon system at scale, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Japanese military doctrine in 1941 emphasized spiritual strength, tactical excellence, and individual courage. Japanese soldiers trained extensively in night operations, close combat, and the offensive spirit embodied in the concept of Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan. Their equipment reflected a different philosophy than the Americans. Japanese rifles and machine guns were generally lighter, more compact, designed for a smaller-statured soldier operating in difficult terrain. The Type 38 rifle, chambered in 6.5mm, was accurate and reliable, but lacked stopping power. The Type 96 light machine gun, despite its excellent design, fired the same underpowered cartridge. Even the Type 92 heavy machine gun, while reliable and well-designed, fired a round that, while heavier than rifle-caliber ammunition, could not compare to the American .50 caliber in terms of range, penetration, or terminal ballistics. More significantly, Japanese weapons reflected an industrial base that could not match American production capacity. By 1941, when the Pacific War began, Japan's entire annual steel production was approximately 7 million tons. The United States produced approximately 75 million tons. This 10-to-1 disparity in basic industrial capacity cascaded through every aspect of military production. Japan built excellent aircraft, built devastating battleships, built effective tanks for their intended role, but they built them in quantities that could not sustain losses in a war of attrition. The same held true for small arms and machine guns. where American factories would produce nearly 2 million 50-caliber machine guns of all types during the war years, Japanese production of all machine guns combined was a fraction of that number. The first major encounters between Japanese forces and the 50 caliber came in the opening months of the war. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, some of the first shots fired in defense came from ANM-2 50 caliber machine guns hastily removed from storage and mounted in improvised positions. Sailors and Marines, working with whatever materials they could find, sandbags, wooden planks, even tent canvas, positioned these weapons and opened fire on the attacking aircraft. The effectiveness was limited, surprise and chaos saw to that, but the weapon's reliability under the worst possible conditions presaged what would come. Chief Petty Officer John Finn, manning a 50 caliber in an exposed position at Kaneohe Bay, continued firing throughout the attack, despite being wounded multiple times. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Messman 3rd Class Doris Miller, an African-American sailor assigned to the USS West Virginia, had never been trained on the 50 caliber machine gun because Navy regulations at the time prohibited black sailors from combat positions. When his ship came under attack, Miller took position behind an unmanned 50 caliber and began firing at Japanese aircraft. He would receive the Navy Cross. These early actions demonstrated something that would become clear as the war progressed. The 50 caliber machine gun was simple enough that even untrained personnel could employ it effectively under stress. This was not an accident of design. It was the culmination of John Browning's philosophy. Make it simple, make it reliable, make it maintainable. The complexity should be in the manufacturing, not in the operation. Japanese weapons, by contrast, often required skilled operators to achieve their full potential. The Type 96 light machine gun was an excellent weapon in the hands of a trained crew. The same was true of the Type 99 light machine gun that replaced it. Japanese pilots flying the Zero could achieve extraordinary results, but the Zero's performance envelope demanded pilot skill. Japanese tactics assumed this skill level across their forces. American tactics assumed that weapons should amplify the capabilities of average soldiers. This fundamental difference in philosophy would prove decisive. Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, provided the first sustained combat between American and Japanese ground forces. Here, in the fetid jungles and along the beaches of this remote island, the patterns that would define the Pacific War began to emerge. Japanese infantry, confident from victories in Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, launched repeated attacks against Marine positions, defending Henderson Field. They expected to overwhelm the Americans through superior night fighting skills, aggressive tactics, and spiritual superiority. What they encountered instead was a wall of machine gun fire that broke their attacks before they could close to effective range. The Marines defending the Lunga perimeter employed extensive fields of fire covered by overlapping machine gun positions. The primary weapon was the Browning M1917A1, a water-cooled 30 caliber machine gun that could sustain fire for hours without overheating. But positioned at key points throughout the defense were M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns. When Japanese forces launched their first major counterattack on August 21, 1942, approximately 900 soldiers of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's regiment attempted to storm across the Tenaru River sandbar. Marine machine gunners opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The 50 caliber positions engaged first, their heavier projectiles reaching out to maximum range, forcing the Japanese to go to ground or die in the open. As the range closed, 30 caliber machine guns joined the fire. Japanese soldiers, trained for close-quarters jungle combat, found themselves caught in killing zones, where movement meant death and remaining stationary meant eventual annihilation by indirect fire. By dawn, fewer than 100 of Ichiki's men survived to retreat into the jungle. The survivors reported experiences that would become grimly familiar to Japanese forces throughout the war. They described machine gun fire that came without warning, that continued without pause, that seemed to have unlimited ammunition. They described projectiles that would punch through palm trees, that would penetrate the logs they sheltered behind, that would wound catastrophically rather than cleanly. The understanding began to spread. The Americans fought differently. The night of October 24th into October 25th, 1942, brought the most desperate fighting of the Guadalcanal campaign. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division, some of the finest troops in the Imperial Japanese Army, launched coordinated attacks against the southern perimeter of the Lunga defense. The attacks came after a grueling march through jungle that would have broken lesser units. Maruyama's soldiers were exhausted, hungry, many suffering from malaria and dysentery, but they were determined. The initial attacks fell primarily on positions held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Pullers, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and elements of the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. Japanese troops advanced in waves, some numbering 200 men, others smaller groups seeking weak points in the American lines. The Marines and soldiers responded with everything they had. Artillery from miles away pounded pre-registered coordinates. Mortars dropped rounds in front of the American positions, and the machine guns fired continuously. Sergeant John Basilone, commanding 2 sections of water-cooled Browning .30 caliber machine guns, fought throughout the night. At one point, Basilone had to send men forward during the battle to clear away piles of Japanese bodies that were blocking his fields of fire. His guns fired so continuously that he had to improvise ways to carry overheated barrels when his asbestos gloves were lost, accepting third-degree burns to keep his weapons in action. Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor. But it was not just the .30 caliber guns that broke the Japanese attacks. Positioned throughout the defense were 50 caliber machine guns that engaged at longer ranges, their heavier projectiles capable of engaging targets that were beyond effective range for smaller calibers. Captain Regan Fuller, commanding a battery that included 2 50 caliber machine guns, watched Japanese troops massing in the jungle for a charge. His 50 calibers opened fire, and the formations simply dissolved. The range was too great for Japanese return fire to be effective. The Americans could engage with impunity. By morning, when the attacks finally ceased, the Marines and soldiers counted their victory in the bodies scattered across the battlefield. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment had lost 553 killed or missing and 479 wounded from its total strength of 2,554 men. The 16th Regiment's losses were not formally tallied, but American burial. Parties counted 975 Japanese bodies in front of the 164th Infantry's positions. Total Japanese casualties exceeded 2,000 men, most killed by machine gun fire and artillery. American casualties, while significant, were a fraction of Japanese losses. More importantly, the Americans could replace their losses. The Japanese could not. What the survivors of Maruyama's division carried away from Guadalcanal was not just the trauma of defeat, but a fundamental reassessment of American capabilities. The reports filed by Japanese officers after their evacuation from Guadalcanal in February 1943 painted a picture of an enemy whose firepower was qualitatively different from what they had encountered in China or even in the early months of the Pacific War. One report, preserved in Japanese military archives and translated after the war, stated plainly, "The Americans do not fight as we expected. They do not close with us. They remain at distance and employ their machine guns and artillery to destroy our forces before we can engage effectively. Their ammunition supply appears unlimited. Their machine guns fire continuously. We suffer casualties from weapons we cannot reach with our own fire. Our soldiers, brave and determined as they are, cannot overcome this firepower through spirit alone." This realization spread through the Japanese military, but understanding the problem and solving it were different matters entirely. Japanese tactical doctrine began to adapt. Night attacks, designed to negate American firepower advantages, became standard. Infiltration tactics replaced frontal assaults. Defensive positions were dug deeper, reinforced more heavily, designed to withstand the kind of sustained fire that American forces could bring to bear. But these adaptations came at a cost. Night attacks, while reducing exposure to American firepower, also reduced Japanese coordination and made it difficult for Japanese forces. to mass their own fire effectively. Infiltration tactics meant smaller units, engaging piecemeal rather than concentrated attacks that might achieve breakthrough. Defensive positions, no matter how well constructed, eventually fell to American firepower when combined with flamethrowers, demolitions, and tank support. The Japanese were adapting to fight a defensive war when their strategic situation demanded offensive action to hold their defensive perimeter. The 50 caliber machine gun, as much as any other single weapon, enforced this strategic dilemma. The aerial dimension of 50 caliber employment proved equally devastating for Japanese forces. In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had achieved its first major success with the Type Ho 103 aircraft machine gun. This weapon, designated Type 1 and later known by its project name Ho 103, was based directly on the American M2 Browning. Japanese engineers, having acquired examples of the American aircraft-mounted variant designated AN-M2 through various means, including examination of crashed or captured American aircraft, recognized the weapon's superiority to their existing aircraft guns. They reverse-engineered the basic design, modified it to chamber a shorter Italian-designed cartridge, the 12.7 by 81 mm semi-rimmed Breda round, and put it into production. The result was a weapon that achieved a higher rate of fire than the American original, approximately 900 rounds per minute compared to the AN-M2's 600 to 800 rounds per minute. This was accomplished by using the shorter, lower-powered cartridge, which required less bolt travel and extraction force. But this came at a significant cost. The Ho 103 had substantially lower muzzle velocity and shorter effective range than the American 50 caliber. Its projectiles carried less energy and were less effective at penetrating armor or inflicting damage. Even more significantly, the decision to copy the American weapon revealed something about Japanese industrial and design priorities. By 1941, when the Ho 103 entered service, Japan was already struggling with the consequences of having multiple incompatible ammunition types across its military branches. The Navy and Army used different rifle cartridges. They used different machine gun cartridges. They used different artillery pieces. This lack of standardization complicated logistics, increased production costs, and created supply difficulties that would worsen as the war progressed. Copying the American M2 but chambering it for an Italian cartridge added another ammunition type to the supply chain. It was a decision that made sense from an engineering standpoint, use the shorter cartridge to achieve higher rate of fire, but it reflected the fragmented nature of Japanese military procurement. The Americans, by contrast, achieved remarkable standardization. The 50 caliber cartridge was used in aircraft guns, ground-based heavy machine guns, and eventually in anti-material rifles. This simplified logistics dramatically. Japanese pilots who flew aircraft equipped with the Ho 103, primarily later model fighters like the Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar and Ki-44 Tojo, found the weapon adequate against American aircraft when they could bring it to bear. But bringing Japanese fighters into effective firing position against American aircraft became progressively more difficult as the war continued and American pilots gained experience and numerical superiority. More problematically, Japanese pilots flying missions over Allied-controlled territory faced American aircraft armed with the original M2 Browning, firing the full-power 50 caliber BMG cartridge. The difference in performance became obvious in combat. American 50 caliber fire could engage at longer ranges, could penetrate more deeply into Japanese aircraft structures, and delivered more energy on target. A burst of American 50 caliber fire into a Zero's fuel tanks, which were not self-sealing in most variants, could ignite fuel and doom the aircraft. A burst into a wing structure could catastrophically damage control surfaces. A burst into the engine could penetrate the cooling system or damage critical components. Japanese aircraft, designed for maximum performance with minimum weight, were particularly vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. The Zero, probably the most famous Japanese fighter of the war, achieved its remarkable range and maneuverability partly through extreme weight reduction. It lacked armor protection for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Its structure, while strong enough for the stresses of flight, provided minimal protection against battle damage. American pilots learned that if they could hit a zero with 50 caliber fire, they could usually destroy it or damage it so severely that it would not make it home. Japanese pilots, for their part, learned to fear the deep, distinctive sound of American 50 calibers firing. That sound, audible even over engine noise and wind, meant that somewhere in the sky a Wildcat or Corsair or Thunderbolt had them in its sights. The transition to the 4U Corsair in late 1942 and throughout 1943 brought an even more formidable 50 caliber platform into service. The Corsair carried 6 AN-M2 machine guns in its wings, with 2,300 rounds total, approximately 400 rounds per gun. This gave a Corsair pilot approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire time, more than enough for multiple attack passes. The Corsair's speed, over 400 miles per hour in level flight, combined with its 650 calibers, made it dominant in the Pacific Air War from 1943 onward. Japanese pilots who encountered Corsairs reported that avoiding the Americans' guns was nearly impossible if the Corsair pilot achieved a good initial attack position. The combination of speed, firepower, and armor protection made the Corsair able to dictate the terms of aerial combat, but it was in the ground attack role that the 50 caliber achieved perhaps its most dramatic impact in the Pacific Air War. The Bismarck Sea action in March 1943 demonstrated this with brutal clarity when Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, realized that conventional bombing tactics were ineffective against Japanese shipping. He directed the development of new methods. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a maintenance officer with a reputation for innovative modifications, removed the bombardier position from B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and installed 450 caliber machine guns. He added 4 more 50 calibers in blister packs on the sides of the fuselage. The result was a B-25 with 8 forward-firing, 50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 500 rounds. Similar modifications were made to A-20 Havoc light bombers, giving them 8 nose-mounted 50 calibers. These strafer aircraft, combined with skip bombing techniques, where bombs were skipped across the water to impact below the waterline of ships, revolutionized anti-shipping operations. When the modified bombers attacked, they would approach at extremely low altitude, under 100 feet, flying directly toward their targets. At ranges of 600 to 800 meters, the 50 calibers would open fire. The effect on Japanese vessels was catastrophic. A B-25 mounting 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns could deliver 1,600 rounds in a 15-second firing pass. Each round, weighing approximately 52 grams, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate steel plating, punch through bulkheads, and continue destroying equipment and killing crew members inside the ship. Japanese destroyers, the escorts for the convoy steaming toward Leh in early March 1943, carried Type 93 13mm machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. These weapons, based on a French Hotchkiss design, were actually quite effective. They fired at 475 rounds per minute, with an effective range of 1,500 meters. On paper, they were adequate for defending against aircraft, but the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed a fundamental asymmetry that Japanese naval planners had not anticipated. A destroyer traveling at 35 knots was, relative to aircraft speeds, nearly stationary. American bombers approaching from astern could fire along the entire length of the ship, maximizing their target area. The pilots were essentially pointing and shooting at a large, slow-moving target. By contrast, a B-25 approaching at 250 miles per hour presented a small, fast-moving target coming head-on. Japanese gunners had seconds to acquire, track, and engage. Even skilled crews struggled to hit aircraft under these conditions. More critically, volume of fire mattered. A modified B-25 with 850 caliber machine guns firing for 15 seconds delivered 1,600 rounds. The 2 Type 93 machine guns typically mounted on a Japanese destroyer, assuming perfectly trained crews with perfect timing, might fire 60 rounds in that same interval. Perhaps 120 rounds if both crews could reload and fire a second magazine in 15 seconds, which was optimistic under combat conditions. 1,600 rounds versus 120 rounds. The disparity spoke for itself. The effect of 50 caliber fire on Japanese destroyers shocked survivors. The heavy projectiles cleared decks of personnel instantly. Anyone exposed above deck simply died or was wounded so severely they could not continue fighting. The 50 caliber rounds penetrated the light plating of gun housings, killing the crews inside. They punched through superstructure bulkheads, they penetrated into the interior of the ships and damaged machinery, ruptured pipes, destroyed equipment. Survivors pulled from the water after their ships sank reported that the strafing runs caused more casualties than the bombs that actually sank the vessels. The psychological impact was devastating. Sailors who survived watched their ships being systematically destroyed by weapons they could not effectively counter. The Americans could stand off at ranges where Japanese defensive fire was ineffective and simply shoot the destroyers and transports to pieces. Then the skip bombs would arrive, finish off ships already crippled by machine gun fire, and the convoy would cease to exist. Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara, who survived the Bismarck Sea battle, would write after the war about the sense of helplessness Japanese naval forces felt when facing American air attack. He described watching B-25s approach, seeing the winking of muzzle flashes as the 50 calibers opened fire, and knowing that his ship's defensive weapons were inadequate. The Type 93 machine guns would fire, tracers arcing toward the approaching bombers, but the volume of American return fire was so overwhelming that it suppressed the Japanese defensive positions. Crews would take cover rather than continue manning their guns under that hail of 50 caliber fire. This meant that even if the Japanese weapons were theoretically capable of shooting down the bombers, the practical reality was that American firepower prevented effective Japanese defensive fire. The lessons from the Bismarck Sea spread through the Imperial Japanese Navy. Future convoy operations would be conducted at night when possible. Ships would take evasive action constantly. Fighter cover would be provided when available, though Japanese fighter strength was already being depleted and could not be everywhere at once. But these adaptations could not overcome the fundamental problem. American aircraft, armed with 50 caliber machine guns and attacking in coordinated formations, could destroy Japanese shipping faster than Japan could replace losses. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's defensive perimeter depended on maritime supply lines. If those supply lines could not be protected, forward positions could not be reinforced or supplied. The campaign in New Guinea, which Japanese planners considered critical to defending Rabaul and the approaches to the Philippines, began to collapse not because of defeats on land, but because American air power, centered on 50 caliber armed aircraft, interdicted Japanese supply lines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ground war in the Pacific presented different challenges but produced similar results. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, each island invasion followed a pattern: massive preliminary bombardment from naval guns and aircraft, amphibious assault, establishment of a beachhead, then grinding combat to eliminate Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese, recognizing that they could not match American firepower in mobile operations, adopted defensive tactics centered on fortified positions designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking Americans. These positions, often dug into caves, reinforced with logs and concrete, protected by interlocking fields of fire, proved extremely difficult to reduce. But the Americans developed systematic methods for dealing with them, and the 50 caliber machine gun was central to those methods. American infantry tactics in the Pacific emphasized combined arms coordination. When a Japanese defensive position was identified, American forces would not simply charge it. Instead, they would coordinate fire support. Artillery would pound the position. Naval gunfire, if available, would strike it. Aircraft would strafe and bomb it, and ground forces would bring direct fire weapons to bear. The 50 caliber machine gun, either mounted on tanks or positioned by infantry heavy weapons sections, would engage any firing ports, observation slits, or exposed positions. The 50 caliber's ability to penetrate cover that would stop rifle fire or even 30 caliber machine gun fire made it invaluable. Japanese defenders, watching 50 caliber rounds punch through logs they thought would provide protection, learned that few positions were truly safe from American fire. The massive projectiles would penetrate multiple layers of sandbags. They would crack concrete if enough rounds struck the same area. They would deform steel that was not hardened armor plate. The M2 mounted on tanks proved particularly effective. American tank doctrine in the Pacific differed from European practice. In Europe, tanks fought other tanks and needed powerful main guns and thick armor. In the Pacific, Japanese armor was limited, and American tanks primarily fought infantry and fortifications. The 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the tank commander's cupola became one of the tank's most used weapons. Tank commanders learned to traverse the 50 caliber across suspected positions, firing continuously at windows, at firing ports, at cave entrances, suppressing any defensive positions while infantry advanced. The technique was simple but devastatingly effective. A tank would advance to a position with good fields of fire, halt, and the commander would spray 50 caliber fire across building facades or jungle tree lines. The sustained fire, delivering several hundred rounds in a matter of seconds, would force Japanese defenders to take cover. While they were suppressed, American infantry would advance to closer positions. The process would repeat. Advance, suppress, advance again. Japanese infantry, trained for close combat where their superior night fighting skills and aggressive tactics could be employed, found themselves unable to close with American forces. Any attempt to maneuver in daylight drew immediate 50 caliber fire. Even at night, American forces used reconnaissance by fire, sending streams of 50 caliber tracer rounds across suspected positions. The visual effect was overwhelming. Every fifth round was a tracer, so Japanese soldiers could watch the streams of light converging on their positions. But for every visible tracer, 4 additional rounds were in the air, invisible but just as deadly. The psychological effect of watching death approach in streams of light broke the morale of even veteran troops. Some units refused to leave their defensive positions even under direct orders, preferring the uncertain safety of their bunkers to the certainty of death under American machine gun fire. The island of Iwo Jima, assaulted in February 1945, provided the ultimate test of American firepower doctrine against Japanese defensive tactics. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese defenders, recognized that the Americans could not be defeated in open combat. He ordered his troops to construct the most elaborate defensive system yet seen in the Pacific War. Miles of tunnels connected hundreds of fortified positions. Artillery pieces were positioned in caves with steel doors that could be opened to fire and then closed to protect the guns from counter-battery fire. Infantry positions were reinforced with concrete and logs, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire designed to survive sustained bombardment. Kuribayashi forbade banzai charges, ordering his troops to kill 10 Americans each before dying themselves. The 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima were prepared to fight to the last man. The Marines who assaulted Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, understood they faced a brutal fight, but they brought with them the accumulated experience and firepower of 3 years of Pacific warfare. Every aspect of American combined arms doctrine would be employed on Iwo Jima's volcanic sand, and the 50 caliber machine gun was everywhere. Landing craft approaching the beaches carried 50 calibers for suppressive fire. Amphibious vehicles mounted them. The first Marines ashore carried heavy weapons sections equipped with 50 caliber machine guns that would be positioned to support the advance. Tanks rolling off landing craft carried 50 calibers on their turrets. M16 Quad 50 mounts, originally intended for anti-aircraft work, were landed and employed against Japanese positions. American doctrine called for overwhelming any defensive position with firepower before attempting to assault it. On Iwo Jima, this meant that when a Japanese pillbox or cave entrance was identified, American forces would coordinate to destroy it. Tanks would move into position and engage with their main guns and 50 caliber machine guns. Infantry heavy weapons sections would add their 50 caliber fire, If the position remained active, flamethrower teams would advance under covering fire to burn out the defenders. If that failed, demolition teams would seal the entrance with explosives. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima quickly learned that American firepower had reached levels they could not counter. Sergeant Tsuneo Abe, one of the few Japanese soldiers captured alive on Iwo Jima, described in post-war interrogations the experience of being under American fire. He stated that the Americans never attacked without first delivering overwhelming fire on defensive positions. He described 50 caliber machine gun fire as particularly terrifying because it would penetrate into the caves and bunkers where Japanese troops sought shelter. The heavy projectiles would ricochet off rock walls, fragmenting, creating secondary projectiles that killed or wounded defenders who thought they were safe. He described watching Americans advance behind walls of machine gun fire that made movement impossible. Any Japanese soldier who exposed himself to fire a weapon would be hit within seconds. Any attempt to counterattack would be met with such overwhelming fire that the attack would collapse before reaching American lines. The casualty figures from Iwo Jima reflected the brutal effectiveness of American firepower. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner, most because they were unconscious or too severely wounded to resist. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. American casualties were also severe, over 26,000, including more than 6,800 dead. But the ratio of American to Japanese casualties was approximately 1.2 to 1, meaning Americans suffered more total casualties than the Japanese garrison. This was unique among Pacific Island battles, where American firepower usually resulted in casualty ratios heavily favoring American forces. The disparity reflected Kuribayashi's defensive tactics and the nature of cave warfare, where even overwhelming firepower took time to reduce fortifications. But it also demonstrated that when Americans were willing to accept casualties to achieve objectives quickly, their firepower could overcome even the most determined Japanese defense. For Japanese military analysts studying the Pacific War's progression, a grim pattern became clear. In 1942, Japanese forces had achieved victories through superior training, aggressive tactics, and fighting spirit. By 1943, American firepower was beginning to offset Japanese tactical advantages. By 1944 and into 1945, American firepower superiority was so overwhelming that Japanese tactics, no matter how skillfully executed, could not achieve more than temporary delays. The 50 caliber machine gun symbolized this shift. It was not a wonder weapon. It did not employ revolutionary technology. It was simply an extremely reliable, extremely effective weapon, produced in vast quantities, supplied with seemingly unlimited ammunition, and employed according to doctrine that prioritized suppression and destruction over conservation of resources. The Japanese attempt to copy the M2 Browning with their Ho-103 aircraft gun revealed both recognition of American design superiority and the limitations of Japanese industrial capacity. By the time the Ho-103 entered widespread service in 1942 and 1943, Japan was already struggling to maintain aircraft production rates. The decision to modify the American design to use a different cartridge, while it achieved higher rate of fire, created additional logistics burdens. More significantly, Japanese industry could not produce the Ho-103 in quantities approaching American production of the M2. Where American factories produced 50 caliber machine guns by the hundreds of thousands, Japanese production of the Ho-103 numbered in the tens of thousands at most. This meant that Japanese aircraft in the later war years often mounted mixed armaments, some with Ho-103 machine guns, others with earlier model weapons, others with various cannon. The lack of standardization complicated training, maintenance, and logistics. Japanese pilots who flew aircraft equipped with the Ho-103 recognized that they had a capable weapon when they could use it effectively. But by 1944, opportunities to use it effectively were becoming rare. American numerical superiority in the air meant that Japanese pilots were increasingly outnumbered. American pilot training, which by this point in the war had benefited from years of combat experience and extensive stateside training programs, produced aviators who could exploit their aircraft's capabilities. Japanese pilot training, hampered by fuel shortages and accelerated schedules to replace combat losses, produced less capable replacements for the veteran pilots lost in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Marianas. A Ho-103 in the hands of a novice pilot facing an experienced American pilot in a Corsair or Hellcat armed with 650 caliber machine guns was not a fair fight. The American advantage in firepower, numbers, and pilot experience proved overwhelming. The final campaigns of the Pacific War brought the 50 caliber's effectiveness to its culmination. The Philippines campaign, beginning in October 1944, saw the weapon employed in every role it had been developed for. In the air, American fighters armed with 50 calibers achieved complete air superiority. On the ground, American tanks and infantry weapons companies used their 50 calibers to suppress Japanese defensive positions. At sea, American PT boats armed with 50 calibers engaged Japanese barges and small craft attempting to resupply isolated garrisons. The weapon was ubiquitous, reliable, and deadly. Japanese forces, by this point in the war largely cut off from resupply and reinforcement, faced American firepower without the ability to respond in kind. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Small arms ammunition was limited. Even food was scarce. But the Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything, especially machine gun ammunition. The air war over Japan itself in 1945 demonstrated the 50 caliber's role in American strategic bombing. B-29s, the massive superfortresses that carried the war to Japan's home islands, mounted 12 50 caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets. These weapons provided defensive firepower against Japanese interceptors. But by 1945, Japanese fighter strength had been so depleted that B-29s increasingly flew missions without significant fighter opposition. The 50 calibers aboard the superfortresses often went unused, but their presence reflected American doctrine. Every aircraft should have sufficient defensive armament to survive, even if separated from its formation. This stood in stark contrast to Japanese aircraft design, which increasingly sacrificed defensive capability for speed or maneuverability. When the war ended in August 1945, Japanese military personnel who had survived to see surrender carried with them profound respect for American firepower. Interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen, conducted by American intelligence officers in the months following the surrender, revealed consistent themes. The Americans had overwhelming material superiority. American weapons were reliable and supplied with ample ammunition. American tactics emphasized firepower over maneuver, and the 50 caliber machine gun, more than any other individual weapon, symbolized American military power. Japanese officers who had studied at military academies before the war, who had been taught that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantages, wrote in their post-war analyses that this teaching had been wrong. Industrial capacity, properly organized and employed, could produce military power that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. One particularly detailed analysis, written by a Japanese army colonel who had commanded infantry in the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns, described the psychological impact of American firepower. He wrote that Japanese soldiers, brave and determined as they were, eventually became unable to function effectively under sustained American fire. He described the effect of 50 caliber machine guns specifically, noting that soldiers who survived being under 50 caliber fire developed what he termed combat exhaustion at rates much higher than soldiers who faced conventional small arms fire. The knowledge that any exposed position could be engaged by weapons that could penetrate cover and kill at extreme ranges created a sense of helplessness. Soldiers would not move during daylight. They would not expose themselves to observe American positions. They would remain in their bunkers or caves, waiting for darkness, knowing that even darkness offered only limited protection, because American forces employed tracer ammunition and reconnaissance by fire to interdict movement. The colonel's analysis concluded that the Americans had created a system of warfare that reduced individual soldier quality to a less important factor than institutional capabilities. American soldiers, he noted, were not inherently better fighters than Japanese soldiers, but American soldiers were supported by superior logistics, superior communications, superior medical care, and superior firepower. The cumulative effect meant that average American soldiers could achieve results that would require exceptional Japanese soldiers to match. And when the exceptional Japanese soldiers were killed, as inevitably happened in sustained combat, they could not be adequately replaced. The Americans, by contrast, could replace losses with adequately trained replacements who could employ their weapons effectively because the weapons themselves, like the 50 caliber machine gun, were designed to be simple to operate and maintain. The industrial dimension of 50 caliber production illustrated this point starkly. American factories produced approximately 350,000 M2H-B heavy barrel machine guns during the war years. This was only a portion of total 50 caliber production, which approached 2 million guns when aircraft variants and other models were included. Supporting this vast number of weapons required vast ammunition production. The 50 caliber cartridge was manufactured by multiple American companies in quantities measured in billions of rounds. Exact figures vary by source, but estimates suggest that American industry produced between 3 and 4 billion 50 caliber rounds during the war years. This meant that for every 50 caliber machine gun produced, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 rounds of ammunition were available. In practical terms, this meant that American forces in the field never faced ammunition shortages for their 50 caliber weapons. Doctrine could emphasize suppressive fire, reconnaissance by fire, and overwhelming firepower because ammunition was effectively unlimited. Japanese industry, by comparison, could not approach these production levels. Total Japanese machine gun production of all types during the war is estimated at several 100,000 weapons. Ammunition production was similarly constrained. Japanese units in the field operated under strict ammunition conservation orders. Machine gunners were instructed to fire in short, controlled bursts. Ammunition resupply was irregular and often insufficient. By 1944 and into 1945, some Japanese units were so short of ammunition that machine guns were ordered to fire only when absolutely necessary, often saving their limited ammunition for final defensive fires when positions were about to be overrun. The contrast with American ammunition expenditure could not have been more stark. The logistical system supporting American 50 caliber employment was itself a marvel of industrial organization. Ammunition was manufactured at multiple locations, shipped to forward supply depots, and distributed to combat units through an elaborate logistics network. American trucks, amphibious vehicles, and supply ships moved vast quantities of ammunition from rear areas to frontline units. The system was so effective that frontline troops could request and receive ammunition resupply within hours or days, even in active combat zones. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled with logistics throughout the war. Limited shipping, tonnage, vulnerability to American submarine and air attack, and inadequate port facilities meant that Japanese units often went without adequate supplies. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, all were in chronic short supply for Japanese forces by the middle years of the war. The end came in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war. Japanese military personnel, ordered to cease hostilities, laid down their weapons. Among those weapons were significant numbers of captured American arms, including 50 caliber machine guns. These weapons, taken from crashed aircraft, overrun positions, or captured vehicles, had been pressed into Japanese service. That Japan needed to use captured American weapons spoke to the desperation of their supply situation. American weapons in Japanese hands served reliably, another testament to the robust design of Browning's creation. But captured weapons could not overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity and logistics that doomed Japan's war effort. In the decades after World War II, military historians analyzing the Pacific War identified several key factors in Japan's defeat. American industrial superiority was primary. American code breaking provided crucial intelligence advantages. American submarine warfare devastated Japanese maritime commerce. American air power, from carrier aviation to strategic bombing, destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. But underlying all these factors was a more fundamental reality. The United States had created a military system that transformed industrial output into combat power more effectively than any previous military in history. The .50 caliber machine gun exemplified this system. It was not the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. It was not the most technologically sophisticated. It was not the weapon that received the most public attention. But it was the weapon that appeared everywhere, that worked reliably, that was supplied with ample ammunition, and that killed efficiently. For the Japanese who faced it, the .50 caliber became a symbol of American military power and a constant reminder of the industrial and material gap between the two nations. Japanese soldiers who survived the war carried memories of that distinctive sound, the deep rhythmic thunder of .50 caliber fire. They remembered watching tracers arc toward their positions and knowing that for every visible tracer, 4 more rounds were in the air. They remembered the helplessness of being engaged by weapons they could not reach with their own fire. They remembered watching their aircraft fall, their ships sink, their fortifications crumble under the weight of American firepower. The hatred was not personal. It was the resentment of skilled warriors facing an opponent who had solved warfare through industrial application rather than martial excellence. It was the frustration of courage and determination proving insufficient against material superiority. It was the recognition that the Americans had changed the nature of warfare itself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.